Hello and welcome to the Measure and Evaluate Internal Communication for Maximum Effectiveness call. My name is Molly and I'll be your coordinator for today's event. Please note that this call is being recorded and for the duration of the call your lines will be on listen only. However, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box found on the webcast page. If at any time you require assistance, please press *0 and you will be connected to an operator. I will now hand you over to your host, Mary Beth Perry, to begin today's conference. Thank you.
We would like to welcome everyone to the IPR webinar series sponsored by the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications, one of the top 5 public relations programs in the U.S. offering undergraduate, graduate, and online master's programs. My name is Mary Beth Perry, and I'm the Research and Development Associate for IPR. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are very excited to have you join us as we take part in AMEC's Measurement Month to shine the spotlight on the importance of PR measurement. This webinar series is presented by the IPR Commission on Measurement and Evaluation. I would like to thank and welcome and introduce our hosts and members of the Commission, Dr. Julie O'Neill and Sean Williams. Julie O'Neill is a professor and associate dean at the Bob Sheffer College of Communication at Texas Christian University. Dr. O'Neill teaches, researches, and consults in the areas of public relations, measurement and evaluation, and employee communication. Dr. O'Neill has published and presented more than 80 peer-reviewed journal articles, proceedings, and conference papers on topics ranging from donor relationships, nonprofit communication, employee communication, standards, and media source credibility. Dr. O'Neill is also a senior associate editor of the Public Relations Journal and serves on the IPR Commission on Measurement and Evaluation, the Journal of Public Interest Communication, and the International Public Relations Research Advisory Committee. She is currently involved with the Commission on Public Relations Education, and she is the former co-chair of the Public Relations Society of America's National Research Committee. Sean Williams is the Vice President and Practice Lead, Education and Internal Communications at True Digital Communications. Previously, he was the owner of Communication Ammo Incorporated from 2009 to 2017, focusing on research-based strategic counsel and execution. Much of his current work centers on the integrated communication ammo planning process and manager training through the face-to-face communication learning program. He is also an adjunct professor of public relations at Kent State University and serves on the board of the PRSA Employee Communications Section and International PR Research Conference and the IPR Commission on Measurement and Evaluation. Thank you so much for being here. Some logistics before I turn it over to our hosts. To live tweet during the webinar, our Twitter handle is @InstituteForPR, and please use the hashtag IPRWebinar. Throughout the presentation, we will have some opportunities for audience engagement. Whenever we ask a question, please respond in the chat box and send to all panelists. We also will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, and at any point during the webinar, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box, and don't forget, you can tweet your question using the hashtag IPRWebinar. With that, I think we are ready, and Sean, I will hand the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Mary Beth, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. On behalf of Julie, we'd like to welcome you, and we thank you for your time and your attention. We also wanted to let you know that the math test will commence right about the top of the hour. When we're done, that's when we're going to test your knowledge of this. No, I'm kidding. There's not going to be any math test. Instead, we're going to give you some practical information about how it is that you can measure your internal and employee communications to the greatest extent possible. We'll have a look at our agenda, basically sort of get to know each other a little bit. We've covered that off with some introductions. We'll have a question for you in just a moment in that regard. We're going to give you some definitions. We're going to define what measurement really is and what we're talking about when we talk about measurement and research and evaluation. We're going to talk a bit about where we came from, how we got to this particular point where we're going to offer you some draft standards for internal communication measurement. We're also going to talk about what the expectations are for the future, and we will get into no small amount of detail to try and make this discussion as actionable for you as possible. So as our erstwhile host, Mary Beth, talked about, Julie and I are partners in crime when it comes to the IPR Measurement Commission. We also have been research partners on several papers over the course of the years, and Julie has been sort of the smart one of the duo, and I really appreciate the fact that she's on this call with me to sweep up after me when I make a bit of a mess. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the other two members of our task force leadership team, and that's Professor Michelle Ewing from Kent State University and also Stacy Smith from Jackson and Wagner. The four of us have sort of captained this effort to try and define standards for employee communication. So it's pretty cool to be in this place with you right now. So now, once again, you're going to use the chat window here, and you're going to just say what it is that you do. Are you in-house? Are you agency? Are you a student, a researcher, a professor? Would love to get an idea of sort of who you are and where you're from. So go ahead and head to the chat window and type that all in. And I see a couple coming through. In-house employee comms. We have a consultant. We've got somebody from government, state government. That's pretty cool. In-house communication consultants. A lot of people within the realm. Corporate comms and digital production. Engagement for a large think tank. That's really cool. And there is coming up in the Q&A moderators, there is Angelos V is saying that he can't hear and there's no sound. Once again, I think we need to just remind people to get the audio that they need to use their phones instead of being within the WebEx. All right, so the pace is slowing down a little bit. We see a fair amount of different angles here, both inside and outside of organizations, as well as on the consultancy and agency side. Looks like a number of different industries might be represented, including government, healthcare, corporate employee communications, the Port Authority. Of a country, that's interesting. In-house communication for frontline employees, excellent. That's very helpful to know sort of where you all come from. So now I'll send it over to Julie, and she'll take us through the next few moments of our program.
Hi, everyone. Howdy from Texas. So we're going to kind of kick off before we start offering our suggestions is just to set the stage, and perhaps you can relate to some of the challenges of measuring and evaluating an internal communication. We hear time and time again in working with clients in our research that it's time-consuming to do this, that it costs money, it's expensive, we don't have the budgets. A frequent concern is the conundrum of looking at long-term outcomes, i.e. looking at our reputation, perhaps looking at authenticity in terms of trust, the things that we try to build in public relations. That takes time versus oftentimes, we're looking at tactical measures of success, how many people landed on our website, how many people are on our intranet. So again, kind of sliding back and forth between long-term versus short-term orientations. It's also can be quite a challenge. This is true of almost any function, is to untangle the contributions of public relations compared to other communication functions and those blurred lines of whether it's advertising or digital media, sales promotion, and marketing. What exactly did we do in internal communication that led to a change in outcome for our organization? That is not an easy task either. And then yet another challenge we oftentimes hear is that people are measuring success in internal communication in different ways. that can really lead to a messiness and a reduced credibility for public relations practitioners or internal communication executives. When we're talking to our management teams and our agency partners, maybe using different terms, if we're global, different parts of our company around the world are measuring in different ways. So again, that can messy up this process and make it not an easy one to do. So moving forward to the next slide, Sean. And so toward adhering these challenges that have been around for some time, there has been an effort in the last 6 years, spearheaded by the Institute for Public Relations, to talk about looking at a way to create these transparent and shared approaches to measuring and evaluating public relations. This is a conversation that's happening among practitioners and academics, and you're seeing these conversations center in spaces such as internal communication, traditional media relations, social media, financial investor relations. So again, you're seeing an effort to say, can we try to come up with a standardized approach when we talk about how we're going to measure and evaluate? So we use the term standard, and that's something we're going to briefly talk about in this presentation. When we talk about developing a standard for internal communication, what we're talking about with that term is something that's like an idea or thing that we use for comparative evaluations. We're using, so everyone can, it's an apples to apples comparison. A standard is not a best practice. So a standard would be something like trust. We all agree that we want to measure trust, or that we all agree that we want to measure authenticity. The practice, or a best practice, would be how are we going to measure trust, or how are we going to measure authenticity. The advantage of having a standard is that it enables more efficiency with our conversations and our efforts. It can bring greater credibility when we're talking to our executives and our partners. It can also have greater reliability. So there's a lot of advantage, and these conversations about standards happen in all types of disciplines, ranging from industrial engineering to advertising to public relations, and so we are now in that space. So having introduced the term standards, we're now going to segue into measurement and evaluation. And these are two terms that we use oftentimes in internal communication. And before we kind of kick off to and drill down about measurement and evaluation, we'd like to hear from you, what is the difference, or how do you define measurement versus evaluation? So if you don't mind maybe entering in a quick response on your chat message, and we'll take a look at that. What is measurement and evaluation to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're starting to get some answers in. Evaluation is the analysis of your measurement. That's an interesting one. Measurement, more scientific. Evaluation would be more subjective. A couple of others coming in. Yeah, the reason why we ask this question is to get some idea to level set some idea of your existing group of knowledge. So it's very helpful to see this coming through. Measurement is an amount, evolution is an interpretation. Measurement is the technical task, evaluation is putting the measurement into context. Yeah, you're definitely in the ballpark when it comes to this. Measurement and evaluation are, as you'll see in just a moment, measurement and evaluation are different stages. We talk about being able to measure either before, during, or after a campaign or an event, and we'll tell you a bit more about that as we move forward here. So a little bit, as promised, a little bit of a rearward focus now to look where we have been over the course of the last 10 years or so. 10 years ago, output measures dominated, meaning we were looking at the activities that we were performing, and we were measuring those things. You know, how many stories on a given topic were posted on our intranet, or what the uptake of our newsletter was, or even, you know, the smile sheets of how it is that people felt about our work. We had the beginnings 10 years ago of internal communication web metrics, where we started to get an idea of what people were consuming and at what rate. And in some cases, that was a disappointing discussion. When I was at one large industrial company, you know, the average news story that we posted got between 100 and 200 views. Well, we had something on the order of 23,000, 24,000 employees who had access to the intranet. So these were extremely disappointing numbers. And as we'll see in just a moment, this is only sort of part of the picture. Then we had the Barcelona Principles, the 2010 edition, which was the original, and then the revised in 2015. And the Barcelona Principles sort of threw down a glove that we picked up on the task force for employee communication standards, and so too did the task force that put together the traditional media relations standards. But Barcelona was a watershed moment when it basically put a set of guidelines together that sought to shape how it is that we measured in the public relations space. As part of that, add value equivalency, AVEs, were repudiated. In the original edition, they basically were called a scam and a fraud. And then in 2015, they doubled down on that and said, look, we really need people to stop offering AVEs to people in favor of some other metrics. And the reason this is important on the internal comm side is that there's still a little bit of that attitude that says that eyeballs is what it is that we're trying to get when we do our internal communication. AVE is add value equivalency, add value equivalency. We started to see some issues with measuring our online world. Certainly in an external comm, that was the case, in trying to figure out exactly how many people actually saw or interacted with your content. And we saw that reflected in internal communications as well. And I think what this was revealing was that we weren't all the way deeply into what actually the impact what the impact of our work was. We saw the decline of mainstream media and different types of media, newspapers, broadcast, cable, et cetera, in favor of more fragmentation, and that had an impact on how it is that people perceived the content internally. That's, you know, they were beginning to see more tailoring and more specific media out there in the world, and this wasn't particularly being reflected within the enterprise. We also saw that integration with marketing was something that was happening, and in many organizations, marketing was taking the lead on all the communication functions. And if I'm internet famous at all for anything, it's the phrase that says, all marketing is communication, but not all communication is marketing. And having worked in an organization where the CMO was the ultimate chief communication officer, there is a certain attitude that comes with marketing that can get in the way of highly effective internal communication if it's not managed particularly well. And then finally, over the course of the last couple of years, as Julie mentioned, we had the Institute for PR Standards Project and the AMEC Validated Metrics Project, both of which were seeking to try and solve this puzzle of how best we could possibly communicate. So back to this concept of measurement and evaluation. We've got measurement, which typically happens during our event, and it tends to be quantitative. We're tending to look at specific metrics as they are happening. We have evaluation that is rearward-facing, that happens afterward, and that tends to be a bit more qualitative and also more holistic. It tends to be more encompassing of what it is that we're trying to achieve. And the result of evaluation should be insight. We're trying to answer the why of why it is that our stuff is working or not working, and we do that to improve our strategy. We're not so much interested in proving our value, which is the title of, I think, about 35 different sessions at PRSA, IABC, even at SHRM. I would imagine there's one at the Association for Training and Development, and then probably in every single conference in every single country, there is something out there that says you need to prove the value of your activity. Well, proof is tough, and it's tough because of some of the things that we'll explore here in just a moment. Let's have Julie pick us up from here.
So we're going to kind of get to the meat of our presentation today about internal communication, and kind of the way we have organized this when we think about measuring and evaluating in internal communication is we have mapped it out according to kind of 4 levels. The first level is what we call outputs. This is a term we use oftentimes in internal communication, and we're really measuring activity. It's the stuff that's easy to measure. It's important to measure, but it's definitely not the end game. It's a means to an end. And so when we talk about measuring our outputs in internal communication, these are just a few examples here, but that we can talk about more. How many stories as an internal communication professional, how many stories did we post in X time frame? How many people read X stories on the intranet? How many number of active users do we have on our enterprise social network? If we were to do a content analysis or to analyze the messages of our enterprise social network, what are our topics? What do they look like? If we were to take a look backward. If we were, we talk about news releases, but again, even though that may be externally focused, it also, though, the blurring of the lines between employees and also being community members, the blurring of those lines and the integration of our messaging across internal to external, that's still something we're going to take a look at. What is our messaging that's going forward outside the organization? Does that match up with what we're doing internally? And perhaps a few more examples could be something like how many people attended the town hall meeting, how many people liked the content. Again, easy to count. We capture this information in a systematic way, in a way that makes sense to our goals or our KPIs. So to take a brief pause, those were just a few examples. We'll let you type in here briefly and respond to us. What are you doing to measure outputs in your organizations?
Yeah, the output measures are interesting. They tend to be sort of the baseline level of how it is that people do measurement, if they do it at all, in internal comms. I worked on a spin-off where we looked very carefully at the use of Yammer. And in the organization prior to the spin, Yammer was not particularly well used, shall we say. And the idea was to move to a different platform, perhaps Facebook at Work. It seemed to be a more familiar platform, something that people might interact with. And as we measured going up to the actual separation, as we measured what was happening on Yammer, we discovered that people were indeed using Yammer at increasing frequency, but in particular departments. So this gave us quite a lot of information we were able to use to change the strategy. And there are a few others here that are coming in, Google Analytics, doing focus groups and surveys, using polls. Polls are awesome. We'll talk a little bit more about those a little later on. Julie?
Okay. So again, as Sean's already talked about, clearly we're going to do a lot of counting. This is a measurement part. This is normally how we measure outputs. How many stories on a given topic, how many people. These can be some of our on-board metrics, whether it's web, enterprise social network, readability, the rate of output change over time. Again, it's what did we do. We report these out in some kind of report format that we share with our teams and our senior leaders. Something even as simple as this is such a simple, graph right here. But I think sometimes we can make it overly complicated, and people like simple graphs of information. What are the stories that have been coded on our intranet or our internal channels by our branding message of what we're whether that's our corporate purpose, it's our corporate mission, our corporate values, are the stories that we're sharing internally. When we do when we kind of do an assessment or an audit, how are our messages stacking up internal inside our organization? I think these results could certainly also be shared with what we're doing externally facing. Are they on the same page? Are they integrated? Because again, as we know, what we're sharing internally tends to be leveraged to be and amplified to external channels as well, or external sources. So again, just getting a sense of this messaging by topics.
And just to add to Julie's point here, so at one organization, we had an overall message that we wanted to get out to the entire workforce that was available online. So we're talking mainly to managers, people who either manage people or functions. And we wanted to get across to them that we were truly a global company, not just a U.S. company with holdings overseas. And so we examined over time, over the previous, X amount of time, how many stories we had that sort of reinforced that, and how many stories might have gotten in the way of that, and did a comparison between the two. And that helped to inform our content strategy very directly.
Again, we just talked about outputs, and I'm looking at some of the responses, and it looks like a lot of people are doing output measurement. But if we moved kind of to the next way we categorize how we might measure and evaluate an internal communication, we conceptualize this as outtakes, okay? And what we're really talking about at this point is have people, or usually we're talking about our employees, have they received, have they paid attention to, do they understand, and have they retained particular messaging or stories that we're sharing? In our standard project that we worked on the last couple of years, we are purporting that there are 4 primary standards that are valuable to employee communication. The first one being awareness, and that we probably all measure most people are measuring some form of awareness inside their organizations. Knowledge and understanding. Our third one is called relevance, and what we mean by that is, do employees find the content and the channel relevant to their needs? A lot of what we do in internal communication is assessing through an audit of some sort, do people find this content relevant to their jobs? Can they do their jobs more readily, or does it help them in any way? Are the way in which you're sharing, the channels that you're choosing, are those considered relevant to employees? We have a very diverse workplace today. We had the beginning of Generation Z and different generations, and they prefer to receive information in perhaps slightly different ways. Do they find that relevant? And then we might have, again, retention of information. Some time needs to go by, and do people retain whatever messaging you think is important, whether that's values or some kind of strategy, competition. Maybe I'll give just one more example of how this is in operation. I think it's fairly straightforward. I work at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, and we have roughly about 1,200 employees, including faculty and staff. And right now at TCU, we are working on a big campaign, a public safety campaign of trying to share information to all the faculty and staff about what to do if there is an active shooter on campus. There are police officers and safety officer are engaged in a campaign with a big slogan called "Less is More," and I'm working with them, and we're trying to measure, after implementing this campaign, if we go back to our community of 1,200, are people aware of this message? Have they received it? Do they understand it? So that would be the second level. So they may be aware of the Less is More campaign for public safety, but do they really know what to do if an active shooter comes on campus and into someone's classroom? Because you can be aware, but you don't really understand or have the knowledge of what to do. That's a very different step. The way we're sharing this information is via videos, it's via training sessions, it's via social media. Do our audiences find that particularly relevant? And then we just implemented this campaign here at TCU. 6 months later in the spring semester, or perhaps next summer or next year, will they have retained the Less is More campaign and what to do in the event of an emergency? I think that's a good example of Outtakes. So again, asking you what you're, go ahead.
Yep, I just thought I'd give you a break, let you catch your breath. So how do we measure those things? I mean, are you measuring at those levels, and we can go back and show them to you again: awareness, knowledge and understanding, relevance, retention. Are you doing this, and if so, how are you doing it? Go ahead and drop that into the chat, if you would. And there are a couple of questions while you're doing that. A couple of questions have come up. One is whether we should add the word agreement to these things. Do people agree with the direction of the organization? I think there are some implications of that. I think it's implied in some of the knowledge and understanding, and certainly the way that you might ask the question in a survey could potentially get there. Pulse surveys, annual survey, engagement survey. Yeah, pretty much relying for those things on what we gather. Julie, back to you.
Okay. So unlike outputs, which tends to be fairly, we can capture a lot of that data now in the digital space, and that's fairly easy, I think, now to capture some of these numbers. When we start talking about knowledge and understanding and relevance, we normally are going to have to do some type of survey, whether that's a poll, taken very quickly via social or on digital, but something is probably going to have to be assessed of a human, because we're talking about human change in people in terms of awareness, understanding. We can infer that people are aware of information, perhaps, though, if they visit the internet or intranet, and if they're viewing the information. So going back to that public safety campaign, if 50% of the faculty and staff have actually viewed the online video, we would infer, hopefully, that there is awareness, at least, of the campaign. And if they're sharing it or making comments, we can go into those comments and take a look at that. Again, that content analysis. We can look at the observation of behavior and other data. Again, so if we were to do some simulations about public safety, we would hope that by observing what people are doing, that they have an understanding and a knowledge of what to do in the event of a crisis. We could also look at search volume. To what degree are people searching for information on a website about a particular topic? Again, the idea being if they're searching for something, you would hope that you could infer, again, that there would be greater awareness and perhaps understanding. The third broad area we're going to talk about today in terms of measurement and evaluation, we've talked about outputs, we've talked about outtakes, and the third one is outcomes. And again, I would postulate that the more we move down this funnel or through this funnel, the more important this is becoming in terms of the value that we're really after. And here what we're looking at, hopefully in the internal communication space, is evidence of change to opinions, attitudes, or behaviors. You'll see there kind of a laundry list of the standards that employee communication professionals and academics believe should be on this list. That these are the things that we should be measuring and evaluating when applicable to our organizations. I'm not going to go into all of these. I think some of these are probably pretty straightforward. I think the ones that were measured the most when we did our research were trust and satisfaction and attitude. But again, there's that list, and we'll mosey on to the next slide here. And think about which of these, maybe I might ask, is which of these do you measure, and how are you measuring some of the ones listed on that slide?
Yeah, the big question with all of this, the big question is, it's like, how do you narrow this down, right? So in the course of the research, when you have a significant proportion of the people that you're you're talking to are discussing these very things, it proves to be a challenge to try and even prioritize these things. So I think this gets into sort of the next phase, right? How do you measure each of these things, and maybe you measure a subset of them. I mean, maybe you're doing something now. There's one note in here that says engagement is one of the biggest outcomes. It'd be hard to measure. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. And yeah, there is a bit of a reliance on surveys to try and get there. Right, Julie?
Again, so when we're talking about changing in attitudes or behavior, again, oftentimes we're going to have to talk to people. Again, you're going to see this emphasis on surveys. We can also, we've talked a lot about measuring. You can also at this point start to look at some qualitative research, maybe getting more into evaluative stage, more holistic, whether that's interviewing or via focus groups about people's perception of trust in their organization or people's perception of satisfaction. Lots of organizations do this. Some organizations might ask folks to keep a diary and document sentiments in their organizations. And again, we can infer some of this from just observation of behavior and some other data. I'll move to this next slide and give you an example of some of this. This is what Southwest Airlines, we've worked with them on our research project, and they shared with us some of the ways they're measuring and evaluating at the outcome level. And for example, so what Southwest Airlines is doing to measure employee attitude, their employee communication team goes into blog comments and their Facebook group, and they're going to qualitatively look at the sentiment and track that to kind of look at people's perception and measuring that culture of Southwest Airlines and employees' attitude about the company itself. In terms of the standard of discretionary output, discretionary effort, and when we talk about that, we're normally talking about the amount of effort employees give to an organization, a project beyond what is required. Southwest Airlines, how they measure that is that they have employees log their volunteer hours in an online system that they track and count. So again, employees are not required to volunteer. It's discretionary, but they're tracking that as part of their social responsibility program. To measure satisfaction, and we all know the importance of benchmarking, Southwest Airlines surveys their employees quarterly, and they do one large survey with an outside vendor at every year. So again, they can keep a pulse on that. And once we have some of these numbers like that satisfaction, it's so great to be able to correlate that with other data that we have at our disposal in internal communication. And it brings up so many opportunities if we can correlate, for example, satisfaction with our outputs, like our stories that we're disseminating, or with other measures that we may be looking at. Okay, sorry, Sean, go ahead. And then our last way we conceptualize how we might measure and evaluate is really, and this is perhaps the drum roll, this should be the drum roll of the presentation, is really what impact does this have on our organization? We all are working for our organizations to pay our paycheck, and we're trying to show the impact that our efforts have on behalf of the organization itself. And what are we doing as an internal communication practitioner to influence that performance at the organizational level? Based upon this big project we worked on the standards, this is the list that practitioners around the world and academics said these are the kind of the must-have standards in this bucket here. Looking at our employee productivity, we know that the more productive employees are, the more of a better impact that is on our organization. How innovative are employees, right? That's a key impact standard. Continuous improvement, to what degree through our communication efforts that we may be facilitating, i.e. via some work groups on an ESN. Is there continuous improvement in our processes and efficiency? What about our reputation? when our employees are happy and they share that with customers or on social and share those stories, as our reputation increasing. Our employee retention, that's always such a key one. To what degree can we retain talent? And then also safety. To what degree through our communication efforts, and I just gave you the example of TCU, do we have increased safety records at our organizations? So again, there's so many different ways. Whereas we all agree on the standard, the practices about how to measure these standards can certainly differ. But again, this should come as no surprise, whether it's peer evaluation or surveys, system metrics, performance reviews for some of the retention and productivity, independent research studies, incident rates and severity indices, attrition rates. A lot of this data we already have in our organizations. It's a matter of populating that into some kind of scorecard or report card that we can share with senior management and our internal communication team. Because a lot of this data is out there. It may not necessarily be communication related, but the things that we do as storytellers have an impact on these measurement indices.
Yeah, there is a question that came through, or a statement came through that says that these organizational impacts are tertiary effects. You don't see how you can correlate productivity, innovation, et cetera, with communication efficacy. Keep thinking that what you can measure is agreement, alignment. Yeah, I think you certainly can correlate these things in the same way that you would do so in a marketing mix modeling sense. There is the statistical set of functions that you can do to tie these things together. The trick is the time lag and getting the time lag of correlations right and accounting for each one of the potential inputs to it. It depends on what the organizational program is. If this is the traditional sort of internal news bureau, then those correlations we would think would be more difficult to ascertain. But Julie, I don't know about you. You're more of a statistician than I am. What's your reaction to that concept?
Well, some of this can certainly be correlation. So let's just go to one example, the one about innovation. I think one of the most exciting things about internal social media networks or enterprise social media is if you can think of like an IBM, a company that is successfully able to organize internal work groups. And if it's done well from a communication perspective, and that's organized by internal comm, if it's done well, and there's a lot of questions about who sees how much of that content is visible, how do groups organize, how is it facilitated and managed, when it's done well, I would argue that that can lead to better innovation for ideas within your organization. So how do you demonstrate that that was through communication? I think you would have to do some kind of correlation to show the number of groups organized, the kind of content, like a content analysis of those comments that were on some of those work groups. But I certainly think it's possible, mostly through correlation analysis. And again, if you wanted to get super sophisticated, you could use a statistician and do regression analysis, marketing mix modeling, which is takes a lot of money, a lot of expertise, but there are ways to do these things. And here's just a very simple example, and this is an example of a nonprofit that I worked with. And you might say, well, how is this? This is still kind of internal communication. I worked with their communication team, and you might say all their members of that nonprofit and their donors in some ways could be seen as a large organization. And the food bank, this nonprofit, was concerned with, when we do communication, are we really driving out trust? Are we engendering satisfaction? Are we engendering commitment? And so these are communication outcomes that we oftentimes talk about in internal communication. Very simply, they were able to do that with a quick survey, and then they could map out their donation levels over time. And it was a very powerful, even though that's not causation, it still is a very powerful correlation to show as these numbers are going up over time, so too are donations to the organization. And then, you could change out what you're going to measure in those, in those charts.
Yeah. To that point, if you put this into an internal communication context, maybe you're not measuring donation levels, maybe you're measuring productivity levels and how it is that they respond to the content that you're putting on your various channels. Maybe you could look at it from a standpoint of managerial behavior. That's a theme that in some research that Julie and I did together some years ago, where we looked at the effectiveness of the communication activities on the behavior of managers when it came to holding staff meetings, having developmental discussions with people, in essence being a better manager as a consequence of consuming the various communication products that our team had put together. So sort of the first step in getting started with all of this stuff is unmeasurable objectives. I mean, another internet famous line of mine is objectives are everything. And you think to yourself, for the given stakeholder, audience, public, whoever it is that you're reaching, the different employee group, the specific managerial team or department, what do you need those people to think, feel, or do as a consequence of your communication with them? And that objective setting process, gets you in shape to be able to measure these things. So, you look after you've got the objectives down, then you determine which messages, strategies, and tactics are going to have the most impact and would be the most cost-effective, and then you use those things. And then as you evaluate over time, looking to see whether you're changing at the outtake, at the outcome, or at the organizational impact level, then that becomes the baseline that you use for your communication activities. So some of you have answered this question in pieces earlier, but aside from the surveys that you're doing, are you doing any other sorts of measurement? What are the things that you're actually engaged in, and you go ahead and put in the chat, what are the things that you think really should be measured in your organization, and how can you do that? And while you're adding to our discussion here, a question comes in: how do you visualize results in a report? Do you use dashboard software, or do you create the results in a custom-built report? I have one answer to that. Julie, do you have an answer you'd like to share?
I think I've seen all the above. I'll let you go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, no problem. The thing is that a lot of the custom dashboards are there to make things easier to read and more attractive. And there's a good reason why it is you would want to do that, depending on who it is you're handing off your report to. We use a data visualization software within True Digital. We do quite a lot of measurement on the marketing side of things. And I'm drawing a complete blank on which one it is, but that doesn't really matter. You can message me privately, and I can get that for you. But there's good reason to use one that helps you to visualize these things. We started out just using the in-house stuff that we found on Excel and PowerPoint, and then as we grew more sophisticated and grew to have more and more clients to report out on, then we began using visualization software. It kind of depends on your budget and what the expectations of the people that you're sharing with are. And that may not seem like much of an answer, but that's really the truth. All right, so views, shares, and comments, Adobe Analytics, the usual sort of stuff. So and I know we're coming up on the top of the hour and want to leave just a few more moments for some questions, but when we put all this together, I think what it is that we want to get across to you today is to think about the organizational impacts first, and this addresses how it is that you connect communication activity to the impacts that we shared. Look at revenue, expense control, look at the HR related data, and then ask yourself, what are the communication outcomes that are going to most contribute to those things? We know, for example, in manufacturing that safety, quality, and productivity are the most important measures that are being used to evaluate the effectiveness of the plant, of the manufacturing processes. Well, what are the communication outcomes that are going to support those things? And then once you have the communication outcomes, what are the activities, the outputs, and the immediate results of those things that are going to most contribute to them? So the issue that you probably have seen, and at least one person has already dropped it into the chat, and that's the question of engagement. You know, Sean, Julie, where is engagement as a standard? And the answer to that question, my friends, is that we have the things that contribute to engagement accounted for. Because when we did our research, whether it was in the Delphi study with internal communication leaders from, you know, around North America and across the universe, it seems, or whether it was among the, say, 300 and some odd people that we had the chance to share with at PRSA and at the International PR Research Conference, it was more important for them to understand what contributed to engagement so that the measurements would be more helpful, would be more strategic in essence. You know, we did, at one organization I worked, we did the very famous 12-question thing from those guys. And the problem with the results was we didn't know exactly what to do from a communication perspective to address the problem. We weren't sure whether it was a question of job satisfaction, whether it was a question of perception of authenticity. We didn't understand what was underpinning the results that we were seeing. And so as a consequence, we were left sort of guessing on which levers to pull in order to get where it is we need to get. So I think what we need to do is figure out who owns the data and get with them so that you can begin matching your communication activity data with those that are outside of your department. This is a really critical issue. And when you make friends with these people, as you know, there's one organization where I made friends with HR and with IT, this gave us access to a whole lot of information that we would not normally have had. So to summarize, you know, connect these dots between organizational impact and output. Make sure you find the data where it is. It's there. You just need to make friends with the people who have it. Build your strategy based on solid research. Use your measurement to figure out what's working and what's not, and you can see the rest of these here. Just be aware of the fact that some of the indicators you're looking at are going to be leading and some of them are going to be lagging. And Julie, you can take us home.
Yeah, I see a question here from someone. I'm going to go ahead. We only have a few minutes left. Someone's asking, I guess, Krista, are you going to address engagement as it relates to satisfaction? And that's a great question. A lot of companies say are measuring engagement, and engagement through all the research, there's a lot of research out there on internal communication, and it strongly suggests a very positive correlation between engagement and job satisfaction. In fact, engagement is related to a myriad of positive factors such as increased satisfaction, increased productivity, increased employee retention, increased recruitment. So there is a lot of sustained research out there. I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about those studies, to visit the Institute for PR, their organizational center. Their organizational center on their website has a lot of that research that's out there. And again, as internal communication practitioners, we can easily, if we're measuring engagement through a third-party vendor, we can correlate that with satisfaction. And there's also things that lead to engagement. So again, it's a matter of thinking those through and looking for those connections of correlations of what we do from a communication perspective. That was a very long answer. I don't know if that helps.
And we understand that even though we're close to the top of the hour, that if you do have some questions, we do have another 3 to 5 minutes or so that we can spend with you to get your questions answered. Certainly welcome to keep in touch with both Julie and me as you will, and we'll go ahead and we'll look here to see if there are a few other questions that come in. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a question from Alan. Curious if you think new research in behavior is taking us into dangerous territory, you know, human subject panels. You want to tackle that one, Julie? Have you seen that? I mean, we've seen some of the neuroscience sort of work. I think Terry Flynn had a paper at IPRC either last year, I think it was last year, on it.
Well, I think it depends on how you're operationalizing or conceptualizing behavior. There are other behaviors that we don't have to go into a human subjects panel. I mean, things like our retention rate, that's behavior, and we didn't have to do anything besides look at our numbers. If we look at our safety record on a manufacturing line and has that improved because of some safety videos that we helped to create, that's pretty straightforward. Have more of our employees contacted their legislators. Have more of our employees helped us with recruiting on LinkedIn. These are all behaviors that I don't think are a dangerous territory in my perspective. I hope those are a few examples.
Well, and Alan, I think the marketing research, the market research folks have been, looking at sort of the behavioral side of this thing, back to why we buy, right? Trying to figure out what it is that's underpinning, people's decisions when it comes to buying. So, I think there's always a danger that research can be misused, and it can be used to manipulate instead of simply to serve. For my money, I'd be interested to see how these things develop over time. As many of you know, I straddle two worlds, the academy and the practice, and the academic in me is really interested in where it is that this all is going to lead us. But I still believe in sort of the basics of what we've presented here. The idea that there is a difference between measuring what people are reporting to you and measuring what it is you're actually able to observe. And maybe I should have been an anthropologist, because I think it can be very interesting to see what people's behavior is, particularly online behavior. I think it's fertile ground for more understanding. All right, Mary Beth, let's turn it back over to you. I think we're ready to go home.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This marks the end of the presentation, and a video of this presentation will be made available on the IPR website very soon, within 7 days of today's session. You will be sent an email with the link to the video once it is published. And we would like to thank our hosts once again, Julie and Sean, as well as our sponsor, the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications, and of course you all for attending. Thank you so much. And we hope you will join us again in January for the next IPR webinar, which will also be hosted by the IPR Commission on Measurement and Evaluation. Stay tuned for more details. Thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's call. You may now disconnect your lines. Hosts, please stay connected.